Welcome back. Or if you're just joining us, welcome to the second hour of our journey through the history of post-mortem photography. Get comfortable, let your breathing slow, and prepare to explore how these Victorian images were rediscovered, how we understand them today, and what contemporary practices echo this once common custom. In the first hour, we traveled through the Victorian era when photographing the dead was a natural expression of grief and love. We explored elaborate mourning customs, technical challenges, and the heartbreaking reality of child mortality that made these images so common. Now we'll examine what happened after the practice ended, how these photographs survived or were lost, and how modern audiences have reacted to discovering them. Don't worry about following every detail. Let the words wash over you gently, like waves on a shore. If you drift away before our story ends, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin with the moment when these forgotten photographs started being rediscovered. The rediscovery, estate sales, and antique shops. The rediscovery of Victorian post-mortem photography began quietly in the 1970s and 1980s, when antique collectors and photography enthusiasts started finding these images in estate sales, flea markets, and antique shops. Often, the sellers didn't realize what they were selling, having found old photograph albums or boxes of images while clearing out estates and putting everything out for sale. A collector browsing through a box of old photographs might find formal Victorian portraits, stiff poses, serious faces, elaborate clothing. Then, mixed among these ordinary images, they would encounter something different. A photograph of a child lying down, eyes closed, surrounded by flowers. At first glance, it might look like a sleeping child. But something would seem off, the stillness too complete, the position too formal, the flowers too funeral. Closer examination would reveal the truth: this was a photograph of a dead child. These discoveries were initially unsettling even to experienced antique collectors. People who happily collected Victorian clothing, furniture, and other artifacts found themselves uncertain about post-mortem photographs. Were they morbid curiosities? Historical documents? Art objects? Personal family treasures that shouldn't be separated from the families they belong to? The collectors struggled with how to categorize and understand these images. Some collectors began specializing in post-mortem photographs, actively seeking them out and building collections. These early collectors were motivated by various interests. Some were drawn to the photographs as examples of early photographic technique and Victorian material culture. Others found them emotionally powerful, moving expressions of grief and love. Still others approached them more as curiosities, strange artifacts from a time when people did things differently. Photography historians began paying attention to post-mortem images as examples of how photography had been used in its early decades. These scholars recognized that post-mortem photography represented a significant portion of early photographic practice, something that needed to be documented and understood to have a complete picture of photography's history. Academic articles and books began appearing that examined post-mortem photography seriously rather than dismissing it as a macabre oddity. Museums started acquiring post-mortem photographs for their collections. Medical history museums, photography museums, and social history museums recognized these images as valuable historical documents that revealed much about Victorian culture, death practices, and the history of photography. Curators had to grapple with how to display them responsibly, acknowledging their historical importance while being sensitive to the fact that these were real dead people, often children, whose images were being viewed by strangers. The market for Victorian photographs generally, and post-mortem photographs specifically, began to develop. Prices varied wildly depending on the image's quality, condition, and content. A well-preserved daguerreotype of a beautifully composed post-mortem portrait might sell for hundreds or thousands of dollars. More common examples on paper or later formats might sell for much less. The most valuable were typically those with exceptional artistic quality or unusual circumstances. As more collectors entered the market, ethical questions emerged. Should people profit from buying and selling images of dead people, especially dead children? The photographs had been created as intimate family memorials, never intended for strangers' eyes or commercial sale. Yet decades or centuries had passed, the families were gone, and the images existed as orphaned artifacts. If collectors didn't preserve them, they might be lost entirely, thrown away by people who found them too disturbing to keep. The Internet era and widespread awareness. The Internet transformed awareness of post-mortem photography, taking what had been a niche interest among collectors and historians and making it widely known to general audiences. This happened gradually through the late 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s and 2010s. Early websites dedicated to Victorian photography began posting examples of post-mortem images alongside other period photographs. These sites, often created by collectors or historians, provided context and explanation, helping viewers understand what they were seeing and why these photographs had been created. The images were striking and strange enough that they began circulating more widely, shared by people fascinated by the Victorian era's different relationship with death. Social media accelerated this circulation dramatically. Victorian post-mortem photographs became viral content on platforms like Reddit, Tumblr, Pinterest, and Facebook. A striking image of a dead child posed to look alive, or an elaborate family portrait including a deceased member, would be shared thousands or millions of times. These shares often included minimal context, leading to widespread misunderstanding about the practice. One of the most common misconceptions that emerged from internet circulation was the belief that Victorians routinely posed dead people to look alive using elaborate stands and supports, creating images where the deceased appeared to be standing, eyes open, looking directly at the camera. This belief was fueled by misidentified photographs, images of living people in Victorian stands, which were used for living subjects to help them stay still during long exposures, were mistakenly labeled as post-mortem photographs. Websites and social media posts claiming that any Victorian photograph showing someone with a slightly odd expression or blurred features must be a post-mortem photograph proliferated. This led to countless ordinary Victorian portraits being mislabeled. The misconception became so widespread that people began to believe post-mortem photography was more common than it actually was, and that the poses were more elaborate and deceptive than they typically were in reality. Photography experts and historians pushed back against these misconceptions, writing articles and social media posts explaining how to actually identify post-mortem photographs. They pointed out that most genuine post-mortem images showed subjects lying down or clearly deceased, that painted-on eyes were rare, and that the elaborate stands visible in some Victorian photographs were for living subjects who needed to stay still, not dead bodies being propped up. But correcting misinformation proved difficult once it had spread widely. Despite the misinformation, the Internet also created opportunities for legitimate education about post-mortem photography. Museums created online exhibits. Historians published blog posts and articles with carefully researched information. YouTube videos explored the practice with appropriate context. Photography archives digitized their post-mortem collections, making them available for study. This wealth of accurate information existed alongside the misconceptions, available to those willing to look beyond viral social media posts. Online communities formed around Victorian death practices and post-mortem photography specifically. These communities included collectors, historians, people with academic interests, and those with more personal connections, perhaps having found post-mortem photographs of their own ancestors. These communities could be supportive spaces for discussing the images respectfully, but they also sometimes veered into treating the photographs as entertainment or curiosities without adequate consideration of their origin as grief-stricken family memorials. The commercial market for post-mortem photographs expanded online. Auction sites and specialty dealers offered images for sale to collectors worldwide. Prices became more transparent and market-driven. The ease of online buying and selling made the images more accessible but also intensified ethical concerns about the commercialization of these intimate family artifacts. Modern reactions and emotional responses. Contemporary viewers encountering Victorian post-mortem photographs for the first time tend to have strong emotional reactions, and understanding these reactions reveals much about how our relationship with death has changed over the past century. The most common initial reaction is shock or revulsion. For many modern viewers, the idea of photographing a corpse, especially a child's corpse, seems deeply wrong. The photographs can trigger visceral discomfort. These are dead bodies, and our culture has taught us that dead bodies should be hidden, handled only by professionals, kept separate from daily life. Seeing them displayed in family portraits or posed with living relatives violates expectations about appropriate boundaries around death. Following initial shock, many viewers experience a kind of morbid fascination. They continue looking at the images despite or because of their discomfort, drawn by the strangeness, the historical distance, the glimpse into practices so different from contemporary norms. This fascination isn't necessarily disrespectful. It can reflect genuine interest in understanding different cultural approaches to death, but it can also shade into treating the images as macabre entertainment rather than as documents of real grief. Some viewers, after learning the context, develop empathy and sadness. Understanding that these photographs represented desperate attempts to preserve memory of loved ones, particularly children who died before other photographs could be taken, transforms the images from disturbing curiosities to poignant expressions of loss. The grief visible in parents' faces, the care taken to dress and pose the deceased, the flowers and symbols of love, these become touching rather than merely strange. The photographs often prompt reflection on mortality and how different our relationship with death has become. Viewers realize that their own discomfort says something about contemporary culture, about how death has been removed from everyday experience, medicalized and professionalized and hidden away. The Victorians' willingness to confront death directly, to incorporate it into family imagery, can seem both alien and perhaps, in some ways, healthier than modern avoidance. Cultural and generational differences shape reactions significantly. Older viewers who might remember wakes held at home, or who grew up in cultures with more open death practices, often find post-mortem photographs less shocking than younger viewers whose only experience with death is sanitized and institutional. People from cultures that maintain traditions of photographing or displaying the deceased may find Victorian practices recognizable rather than bizarre. The photographs can trigger personal grief and memory. Someone who has lost a child might look at Victorian images of dead children and feel profound connection to those long-ago parents' grief. Others who have experienced recent loss might find the photographs helpful in processing their own grief, seeing historical precedent for memorializing the dead through images. The universal experience of loss creates bridges across temporal and cultural distance. Collections and collectors. As post-mortem photography gained recognition as a historical phenomenon, certain individuals and institutions built significant collections. These collectors have played crucial roles in preserving images that might otherwise have been lost or destroyed, though their work raises ongoing ethical questions. Stanley Burns, a physician and photography collector, assembled one of the world's largest collections of post-mortem photographs, eventually containing more than 3,000 images. Burns approached the collection from both medical and historical perspectives, documenting American death practices and photographic history. His collection includes daguerreotypes, tintypes, cabinet cards, and other formats spanning several decades of the practice. Burns has published books featuring images from his collection, making them available for scholarly study and public education. Burns's work demonstrates both the value and the complexity of collecting post-mortem photographs. His systematic collection preserved images that documented important aspects of cultural history. His research and publications provided context that helped people understand the photographs appropriately rather than simply viewing them as morbid curiosities. Yet his collection also involved purchasing images that were originally private family memorials, raising questions about whether such images should be bought and sold. Other significant collections exist in museums and archives. The Burns Archive, the Thanatos Archive, and various university collections house substantial numbers of post-mortem photographs. These institutional collections generally provide better long-term preservation than private ownership, as institutions have resources for proper storage, conservation, and cataloging. They also make images available for scholarly research while controlling access in ways that respect the subject's dignity. Private collectors continue to seek post-mortem photographs through antique dealers, auction houses, and online marketplaces. The motivations for collecting vary widely. Some collectors are drawn to the historical and artistic aspects, viewing the photographs as important cultural artifacts and examples of early photographic practice. Others collect them as part of broader interests in Victorian culture, mourning customs, or memento mori traditions. Still others are attracted by the photograph's strangeness and emotional power, finding them compelling in ways that ordinary Victorian portraits are not. The ethics of collecting post-mortem photographs remains contentious. On one hand, collectors have preserved images that might otherwise have been discarded. They've created markets that give these photographs monetary value, which paradoxically helps ensure their preservation. Things with value are more likely to be kept and cared for than things considered worthless. Serious collectors often research their photographs, trying to identify subjects and learn their stories, giving names back to anonymous dead. On the other hand, the buying and selling of post-mortem photographs treats intimate family memorials as commodities. The people in these photographs never consented to having their death images owned by strangers or displayed publicly. Their families created these photographs for private mourning, never imagining they would end up in collections or museums. The commercial market can feel exploitative, profiting from others' grief and loss. Some collectors attempt to reunite post-mortem photographs with descendants when possible. If research reveals the identity of subjects, collectors may try to contact living family members to offer them the photographs. These reunions can be emotional and meaningful, returning family history that had been lost. However, descendants don't always want these photographs. Some find them disturbing and prefer not to have images of ancestors they never knew, photographed in death. The question of whether these photographs should remain in private hands or be donated to institutions is ongoing. Private collectors often have passion and knowledge that serves preservation well. They may care for photographs with dedication that underfunded institutions cannot match. But institutions offer permanence, professional conservation, and controlled access that private collection cannot guarantee. The ideal solution might be for private collectors to eventually donate their collections to appropriate institutions, but this doesn't always happen. Museum exhibits and public display. Museums that choose to display post-mortem photographs face difficult decisions about how to present these images respectfully while acknowledging their historical importance. Different institutions have taken different approaches, each with its own reasoning and challenges. Some museums display post-mortem photographs prominently as part of exhibitions about Victorian culture, photography history, or death practices. These exhibits typically provide extensive context, wall text explaining the practice, its historical moment, why families created these images, and how we should understand them today. The goal is to prevent viewers from simply being shocked or repulsed, instead encouraging thoughtful engagement with different cultural approaches to death. Content warnings have become standard for exhibits including post-mortem photographs. Museums typically post signs alerting visitors to potentially disturbing content ahead, allowing people to skip those sections if they choose. This is particularly important for exhibits that might include young children as visitors, as parents need to make informed decisions about what their children view. The warnings acknowledge that despite historical and educational value, these images can be genuinely upsetting to some viewers. Some institutions choose more restricted display methods. Post-mortem photographs might be available in research collections but not displayed publicly. Or they might be shown in educational contexts like academic conferences or specialized tours but not in general public exhibits. These restricted approaches prioritize respect for the deceased and sensitivity to visitors' potential distress over broad public access. Digital presentation creates new possibilities and problems. Museums can create online galleries of post-mortem photographs, making them available for research without requiring physical display. These online presentations can include more extensive context than wall labels allow, with detailed essays, historical background, and guidance for interpretation. However, online presentation also means less control over how images are viewed and shared. Once posted online, post-mortem photographs can be downloaded, shared on social media, and circulated without context, potentially leading to exactly the decontextualized consumption that careful museum presentation tries to avoid. Photography museums face particular challenges because they want to acknowledge post-mortem photography as part of the medium's history while also being sensitive to the human subjects. Some have mounted exhibitions specifically about memorial photography, tracing its development, decline, and legacy. These focused exhibitions allow for deep exploration of the practice with appropriate scholarly apparatus, though they also risk sensationalizing the subject by making it the main attraction. Medical and health museums often include post-mortem photographs in exhibits about historical approaches to death, disease, and mourning. In these contexts, the photographs serve as evidence of how people coped with high mortality rates, particularly child mortality. They document historical reality in ways that statistics and text cannot, making visceral the grief and loss that shaped earlier eras. The reaction from visitors to post-mortem photography exhibits varies widely. Some visitors find them fascinating and spend significant time examining images and reading context. Others glance quickly and move on, uncomfortable with the content. Still others express gratitude for the exhibits, noting that the photographs sparked important conversations about death, mortality, and how our culture handles grief. Museums track these reactions through visitor comments, surveys, and observation, using feedback to refine how they present challenging content. Descendant communities sometimes object to public display of post-mortem photographs from their cultures. Native American tribes, for example, have raised concerns about post-mortem photographs of tribal members being displayed or held in museum collections, viewing this as disrespectful to the dead and violating cultural protocols. Museums have increasingly worked with descendant communities to address these concerns, sometimes repatriating photographs or removing them from display when requested. Finding your ancestor's post-mortem photograph. For some people, post-mortem photography shifts from historical curiosity to intimate personal discovery when they find images of their own ancestors. These discoveries happen in various ways and provoke complex emotional responses that illuminate the practice's continuing power. Family attics and basements remain common discovery sites. Someone sorting through inherited boxes of family photographs encounters an image that's different from the others. Maybe it's a formal portrait of a child in a white gown, lying down, surrounded by flowers. Maybe it's a family group where one person looks subtly wrong, too still, oddly positioned, eyes not quite right. Closer examination reveals the truth: this is great-great-grandmother as a baby, photographed after death. Or Uncle William, who died at age 3 in 1887. The family member becomes part of a history that had been abstract and distant. These personal discoveries often trigger extensive genealogical research. People want to know the story behind the photograph. Who was this person? How did they die? What were the circumstances? Genealogical records, death certificates, census data, and family Bibles are consulted. Sometimes living elderly relatives remember hearing stories about the infant who died before their grandparents were born. These research efforts reconstruct lives that had been reduced to a single death portrait. Emotional reactions to discovering ancestor post-mortem photographs are diverse and complicated. Some people feel grief for relatives they never knew, connected across generations by the visible evidence of loss. Others feel gratitude that the photograph exists, providing a face for a name in the family tree. Still others are disturbed, uncomfortable with this intimate view of a family member's death, wishing they hadn't seen it. The photographs can complicate family narratives and identities. A family might have believed they had no photographs of certain ancestors. The discovery of a post-mortem photograph means they do have an image, but only one taken in death. This can feel like both gain and loss. You now have a face to imagine, but it's a face marked by death rather than life. The photograph raises as many questions as it answers about who this person was. Some descendants choose to display their ancestors' post-mortem photographs in their homes, integrating them into family memory and honoring the grief of ancestors who created these images. Others keep the photographs but store them privately, unable to look at them regularly but unwilling to destroy family artifacts. Still others give the photographs to archives or museums, feeling that their historical value outweighs personal attachment. Finding a post-mortem photograph of an ancestor can change how someone thinks about their family history. It makes the past more real, more emotionally immediate. Statistics about high child mortality rates in the 19th century become personal when you're looking at your great-great-aunt who died at 6 months old. Understanding that your great-great-great-grandparents grieved this child, commissioned this photograph, kept it for the rest of their lives, this knowledge creates connections across time. Some people seek out post-mortem photographs of ancestors, searching antique shops, online auctions, and dealer catalogs for images that might show their family members. This active searching reflects desire to recover family history and honor ancestors by bringing their images home. Success in these searches can be profoundly moving, a kind of rescue of family memory from obscurity. Online genealogy communities share post-mortem photographs that members have found, hoping others might identify unknown subjects or provide historical context. These communities have developed expertise in dating photographs, identifying locations based on photographers' marks, and generally helping people understand the images they've discovered. The collective knowledge helps give names and stories back to anonymous subjects. The ethics of display and commerce. The ongoing existence of markets for post-mortem photographs, and their display in public and online contexts, raises persistent ethical questions that don't have easy answers. These questions touch on fundamental issues about dignity, memory, consent, and how we treat the dead. The core ethical tension is that post-mortem photographs were created as private family memorials, never intended for strangers' eyes. The people in these photographs couldn't consent to having their images bought, sold, collected, or displayed publicly. Their families created the images for specific mourning purposes within intimate family contexts. By what right do we now treat these images as historical artifacts, art objects, or commercial commodities? One argument for current practices is temporal distance. These photographs are now more than a century old. The subjects are long dead, as are their immediate families and anyone who knew them personally. At what point does historical distance make images public rather than private? If we waited for all descendants to die before making images public, we'd never have historical photography collections. Some degree of temporal distance is necessary for historical study to happen at all. Another justification is preservation and education. Without collectors and museums, many post-mortem photographs would have been destroyed. The buying and selling, however uncomfortable, creates economic incentives for preservation. The public display, while potentially exploitative, educates people about historical death practices and prompts reflection on contemporary attitudes toward mortality. These practical benefits might outweigh concerns about violating original intent. Critics counter that preservation and education could happen through donation and institutional collection without commercial markets. Museums could acquire post-mortem photographs through donation from families or estates without anyone profiting from their sale. The educational value doesn't require commercial exploitation. The fact that markets exist. Contemporary memorial photography. While Victorian-style post-mortem photography largely disappeared from Western culture, memorial photography never truly ended. It evolved into new forms that serve similar functions while fitting contemporary sensibilities and technologies. Understanding these modern practices reveals continuities beneath apparent change. Hospital photographers now routinely offer services for families who experience stillbirth or infant loss. When a baby is stillborn or dies shortly after birth, hospital staff may arrange for a professional photographer to create images of the infant, sometimes alone, sometimes with parents or siblings. These photographs serve the same basic function as Victorian post-mortem images, providing tangible proof that this child existed, giving families something concrete to hold on to, creating memories where life experiences will be few or none. Organizations like Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep train volunteer photographers to provide these services free to bereaving families. The photographers understand they're documenting tragedy and approach the work with appropriate sensitivity. They create images that are dignified and beautiful, capturing tiny fingers and toes, the curve of a cheek, parents cradling their baby. These photographs help families process grief and are often treasured for lifetimes, just as Victorian memorial photographs were. The aesthetic of contemporary infant loss photography differs markedly from Victorian post-mortem images. Modern photographs tend to be softer, more artistic, often in black and white. They might focus on details, hands holding tiny feet, parents' faces pressed close to the baby's. The baby might be wrapped in blankets rather than dressed in elaborate gowns. But the underlying purpose remains identical, preserving an image of someone who died, creating memory objects for grieving families. Some families experiencing the death of older children or adults also commission memorial photography, though this is less common than for infant loss. These photographs might be taken at hospitals or funeral homes, capturing the deceased in their final arrangements before burial or cremation. The practice remains relatively private and uncommon, but it exists as an option for families who want such images. The rise of digital photography and smartphones has made informal death photography more common, though often quietly and privately. Family members might take smartphone photos of deceased relatives in hospital beds or at viewings, creating personal records never intended for sharing. These images serve private memorial functions, allowing people to process loss and preserve final memories, even when they wouldn't dream of publicly displaying such photographs. Social media has created new contexts for memorial imagery, though typically not photographs of the deceased themselves. Facebook memorial pages, Instagram tributes, and other online memorials often feature photographs of the person in life, shared by friends and family processing grief publicly. While these aren't post-mortem photographs, they serve similar community functions, marking death, facilitating mourning, preserving memory collectively. Some contemporary artists have explored memorial photography as conceptual work. They create projects documenting their own family members' deaths, hospitals and hospices, or funeral practices. These artistic projects ask viewers to confront death and mortality through photography, echoing Victorian post-mortem photography's function of making death visible while serving artistic rather than purely memorial purposes. Pet memorial photography has become an established practice that parallels human post-mortem photography historically. Pet owners may have their deceased animals photographed, sometimes at veterinary clinics, sometimes at home. These images serve memorial functions for people who consider pets family members and want to preserve their memory. The social acceptance of pet memorial photography suggests that the taboo around death photography may be specific to human subjects rather than photography of death generally. Death photography in other contexts. Post-mortem photography was never limited to family memorials. Photography has documented death in many contexts throughout its history, each raising different questions about ethics, purpose, and impact. War photography has made death visible since cameras could be brought to battlefields. The American Civil War was the first major conflict extensively photographed, and images of dead soldiers, both Union and Confederate, were taken and widely distributed. Matthew Brady and other photographers created haunting images of battlefield carnage, bodies lying where they fell, the brutal reality of war made undeniable through photographic evidence. These battlefield photographs served different purposes than family post-mortem portraits. They were documentary evidence, historical records, sometimes propaganda. They showed the public what war actually looked like, countering romantic notions of glorious combat with graphic reality. The ethical questions were different too. These photographs weren't created for families but for public consumption, and the dead soldiers typically couldn't be identified from the images. Crime scene photography developed as forensic science advanced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Police departments began systematically photographing crime scenes, including murder victims, as evidence for investigations and trials. These photographs were purely functional, documenting facts rather than creating memorials. They were never intended for public viewing, though some have leaked or been published over the years, raising privacy and dignity concerns. Lynching photographs from the Jim Crow era represent perhaps the most disturbing intersection of death and photography in American history. White mobs that murdered black men, women, and children often posed with the bodies and had the scenes photographed. These photographs were made into postcards and distributed, celebrating rather than mourning the deaths. They represent photography's capacity for violence and dehumanization, the opposite of memorial photography's commemorative purposes. Photojournalism regularly documents death, from natural disasters to conflicts to accidents. News photographs of deceased people serve public information purposes, documenting events and illustrating stories. The ethics of publishing such images are constantly debated. When is showing death newsworthy versus exploitative? How do we balance public's right to information against individuals' dignity in death? These questions have no universal answers and are negotiated differently across cultures and contexts. The Holocaust's visual documentation includes thousands of photographs of dead and dying people, taken both by perpetrators and by liberators of concentration camps. These photographs serve as historical evidence of genocide, educational tools for preventing future atrocities, and memorials to victims. Their horror makes them difficult to view, yet their historical importance argues for their preservation and careful display. They represent death photography at its most solemn and necessary. Autopsy and medical documentation photography serves scientific and legal purposes, recording injuries, diseases, and causes of death. These highly technical photographs are not meant for public viewing but are crucial for medical education, forensic investigation, and pathology. They represent another branch of death photography entirely separate from memorial functions. Celebrity death photographs have occasionally leaked or been published, creating controversy. When famous people die, particularly if deaths are violent or scandalous, photographs sometimes circulate despite families' wishes. The collision between public interest in celebrities and basic respect for the dead creates ethical dilemmas that play out in media coverage and public discourse. Social media and modern death imagery. Social media has transformed how death is shared, mourned, and documented in ways that both echo and diverge from Victorian post-mortem photography. Understanding these digital age practices reveals how fundamental impulses around death and memory persist despite technological change. Announcement of death on social media has become standard practice for many people. When someone dies, family or friends often post the news on Facebook, Instagram, or other platforms. These posts typically include photographs of the deceased, but almost always photographs from life, not death. The announcement serves similar community notification functions to Victorian death notices but reaches far more people instantly. Memorial pages on Facebook allow friends to post memories, share photographs, and express condolences after someone's death. These digital spaces become communal mourning sites where grief is expressed publicly and collectively. While the photographs shared are from life rather than death, the public processing of grief echoes Victorian practices where mourning was visible and shared rather than hidden. Some people do share hospital and deathbed images on social media, though this remains controversial and relatively uncommon. Photos of dying loved ones, sometimes with captions about saying goodbye or cherishing final moments, appear in some people's feeds. Reactions are mixed. Some view this as moving and authentic, others as exploitative or inappropriate. The practice reveals tensions between desires for authentic sharing and social norms around privacy and dignity. Last photo posts have become a genre on social media, people sharing the final photograph taken of someone before they died. These might be casual snapshots from hours or days before death, not formal portraits or deathbed images. The practice of marking and sharing these last photos shows the continuing impulse to document and memorialize moments near death, even when the death itself isn't photographed. Memorial fundraisers and charity campaigns on social media often feature photographs of the deceased, using images to personalize appeals and connect potential donors emotionally to the cause. These campaigns serve practical functions, raising money for funeral expenses or related causes, while also creating public memorials. The photographs used are curated carefully, showing the person in life, often emphasizing vitality and personality. Online obituaries now commonly include photographs and sometimes videos, creating multimedia memorials far more elaborate than Victorian death notices. These digital obituaries can include dozens of photos spanning the person's lifetime, creating visual biographies rather than simple death announcements. The abundance of lifetime photographs means death photographs aren't needed, memory is preserved through accumulated images from life. Some people create legacy videos or digital memory books while still alive, knowing death is approaching. Cancer patients and others facing terminal illness sometimes document their final months, creating materials for loved ones to have after death. This represents planning for memorial materials in ways Victorians couldn't, using technology to create extensive records that will serve memorial functions later. Grief influencers and bereavement content creators have emerged on social media, people who share their grief journeys publicly and build followings around loss and mourning. Some share photos from their loved ones' final days or deaths, though this remains controversial. These accounts sometimes help others processing similar losses, but they also raise questions about privacy, consent, and whether grief should be performed for audiences. The permanence and impermanence of digital memorial content creates new concerns. Social media posts and digital photographs can exist indefinitely, potentially outlasting physical photographs. But they also depend on companies and platforms that might not exist forever. Digital memorials could vanish if platforms shut down or policies change, creating different preservation challenges than physical photographs faced. What we've lost and gained. As we approach the end of our journey through post-mortem photography's history, it's worth reflecting on what has changed in how we handle death and memory, what we've lost from Victorian practices, and what we've gained through contemporary approaches. We've lost the Victorian era's directness about death. The Victorians looked at death, touched it, lived with it in their homes, photographed it. Death was visible, acknowledged, integrated into daily life and family experience. For all its difficulties, this directness meant people knew how to handle death, had rituals and practices that provided structure during grief. Our contemporary distance from death, confined to hospitals, handled by professionals, hidden from view, may protect us from trauma but also leaves us unprepared when death comes. We've lost communal mourning practices in many ways. Victorian mourning was public, visible, supported by community expectations and rituals. Everyone knew how to behave around mourners, what to say, what to do. Extended mourning periods gave grief time and space. Contemporary mourning is often private, brief, awkward. We expect people to process grief quickly and return to normal function. The support systems that helped Victorians through loss have eroded. We've lost the comfort of tangible memorials in some ways. Victorian families had photographs they could hold, objects that connected them physically to memory. Digital photographs on phones or computers serve memorial functions but lack the weight and presence of physical objects. The texture of paper, the frame on the wall, these tactile qualities created different relationships to memory than scrolling through digital images does. But we've gained much too. We've gained longer lives. The devastating child mortality that made Victorian memorial photography so common has declined dramatically. Most children now survive to adulthood. Most adults live long lives. This means less grief, fewer losses, fewer occasions requiring memorial photography. The decline of post-mortem photography partly reflects this triumph of medicine and public health. We've gained choices about how to handle death and grief. Victorians had strict social codes about mourning, what to wear, how long to grieve, what rituals to follow. Contemporary approaches offer more flexibility. People can mourn in ways that feel authentic to them rather than following prescribed patterns. This freedom can be liberating, though it can also be overwhelming without clear guidance. Lessons about mortality. As we near the end of our long journey through the history of post-mortem photography, let's consider what these images teach us about mortality, memory, and how we relate to death in our own time. Let your mind drift through these reflections as you settle deeper into rest. Victorian post-mortem photography reminds us that death is universal and unavoidable. Every person in these photographs, the children posed like sleeping angels, the parents holding their dead babies, the photographers who created the images, all are gone now. They died decades or more than a century ago. Their grief, their love, their desperate attempts to preserve memory, all of this happened in lives that ended long ago. This temporal distance helps us see what's always true: we all die, everyone we love will die, and the question is not whether but how we'll face this reality. The photographs teach us that grief is both universal and culturally specific. The Victorian parents who commissioned post-mortem photographs loved their children no less than modern parents love theirs. The grief they felt when children died was as profound, as shattering, as any grief today. This is universal. Love and loss transcend time and culture. But how they expressed that grief, how they memorialized their dead, was shaped by their specific cultural moment. This reminds us that our own practices around death aren't natural or inevitable but culturally constructed, products of our time and place. They show us that memory is fragile and precious. The Victorians understood what we sometimes forget: without tangible records, people fade from memory. Names disappear. Faces are forgotten. Stories are lost. The post-mortem photographs were attempts to fight this erasure, to preserve something concrete against the inevitable fading of memory. That many of these photographs have outlasted any living memory of their subjects proves both the success and the limitation of this preservation. The image remains, but the person is still gone. The images reveal that our relationship with death has changed dramatically, but some impulses remain constant. We no longer photograph our dead in the Victorian manner, but we still create memorials, still seek ways to preserve memory, still struggle with how to honor those we've lost. The specific practices change: digital memorials instead of daguerreotypes, online tributes instead of parlor displays, but the underlying need persists. We want to remember. We want proof that lives mattered. We want connections to the dead to continue somehow. Post-mortem photography teaches humility about our own certainties. The Victorians thought their mourning practices were natural and appropriate. We think ours are. In another century, people might look back at our digital memorials, our social media grief, our death practices and find them as strange as we find Victorian corpse photography. What seems normal and right to us is historically contingent. This doesn't mean all practices are equally valid, but it suggests that certainty about the right way to handle death should be tempered with awareness that others have thought and felt differently. The photographs remind us that children's deaths, while much rarer now, were once devastatingly common. Looking at image after image of dead children, we're confronted with a reality our ancestors lived with constantly, that children frequently died, that parents routinely buried their babies, that childhood was a precarious state. Medical advances have changed this profoundly. The decline of post-mortem photography is partly the decline of child mortality. This is progress we should acknowledge and be grateful for, even as we recognize that some children still die and their parents still grieve. The persistence of the images. These Victorian photographs continue to exist, preserved in collections, circulated online, encountered by people who never knew the subjects or their families. What does it mean that these intimate memorials persist, that they've outlasted their original purpose and continue affecting viewers more than a century later? The photographs have become historical documents, evidence of how people once lived and died and grieved. They tell us things about the past that written records cannot convey as powerfully. We can read about Victorian mourning customs in books, but seeing actual post-mortem photographs makes that history visceral and immediate. The images bridge temporal distance, creating emotional connections across time. They've also become prompts for reflection about our own mortality and grief practices. When we encounter these photographs and feel discomfort or fascination, we're learning something about ourselves, about how our culture has taught us to relate to death, about what we find acceptable or taboo, about our own fears and anxieties around mortality. The images serve as mirrors, reflecting our own attitudes back to us. For some viewers, the photographs provide comfort or validation. People who have lost children, who have experienced profound grief, sometimes find solace in knowing that others throughout history have felt similar pain. The Victorian parents captured in these images grieving their dead children, they understand loss in ways that create connection across centuries. This recognition can be powerful and healing. The images also serve as memento mori, reminders of death, in the tradition that stretches back centuries before photography. Medieval art included skulls and hourglasses to remind viewers of mortality. Victorian mourning jewelry incorporated hair from the dead. Post-mortem photographs continue this tradition, confronting us with death's reality while we're still alive. This confrontation can be valuable, prompting us to consider how we're living, what we value, how we want to be remembered. As art objects, the photographs have aesthetic qualities independent of their memorial functions. Some are beautifully composed, technically accomplished, emotionally powerful images that work as photographs regardless of their subject matter. The interplay of light and shadow, the careful arrangement of elements, the captured expressions, these have value as visual art. Appreciating this artistic dimension doesn't diminish the photograph's memorial purposes but adds another layer of meaning. The persistence of these images online, shared and reshared across social media, means they continue reaching new audiences constantly. Each person who encounters them has their own response, their own interpretation, their own emotional reaction. The photographs that were created for intimate family grief now serve countless purposes for countless strangers. This transformation is both remarkable and troubling. The images have taken on lives of their own, far beyond anything their creators could have imagined. Final reflections and closing. As we conclude our 2-hour journey through the history of post-mortem photography, let yourself settle into the deepest rest. Breathe slowly. Let your body relax completely. Allow these final thoughts to drift through your mind as you slip toward sleep. Photography promised to capture reality, to freeze moments in time, to make permanent what was fleeting. The Victorians used this new technology to preserve their dead, creating images that would outlast memory, outlast living connections, outlast everything except the photographs themselves. And their strategy worked. We still have these images, more than a century later, proof that these people lived and died and were mourned. But the photographs also reveal photography's limitations. The images show us faces, bodies, arrangements of light and shadow on silver or paper. But they don't capture the people themselves. The children in these photographs had personalities, laughed and cried, had favorite toys and foods and games. The adults had thoughts and feelings, dreams and disappointments, complex inner lives. None of this appears in the photographs. The images preserve appearances while the essence remains lost. This is the paradox of memorial photography, and perhaps of memory itself. We can preserve representations, images, objects, stories, but the actual person is gone and cannot be recovered. The photograph is both connection and reminder of disconnection, both preservation and evidence of what cannot be preserved. The Victorian families who commissioned these images understood this paradox. The photographs were better than nothing, but they weren't enough. They could never be enough. Yet the attempt mattered. The care taken to create dignified, beautiful images of the dead, the money spent that families could ill afford, the grief visible in every flower arrangement and carefully folded hand, all of this mattered. It was how these families said goodbye, how they honored their dead, how they tried to make sense of losses that defied understanding. The photographs were acts of love, however strange they seem to us now. When you encounter post-mortem photographs, whether in museums, online, or in your own family archives, remember that these were real people. The baby posed in a white gown lived briefly but lived truly. The parents who held that baby and then posed for a photograph with the small body felt grief as real and shattering as any grief you might know. The photographer who created the image was doing meaningful work, however difficult, helping families preserve what could be preserved. These photographs ask us to think about our own mortality and how we want to be remembered. They ask us to consider whether our contemporary distance from death serves us well or leaves us unprepared for the inevitable. They ask us to honor the dead, not just those in Victorian photographs, but all who have died, all who will die, including ourselves and everyone we love. The Victorians who photographed their dead believed in preserving memory, in honoring those who had passed, in maintaining connections across death's boundary. Their methods were different from ours, but the impulses were human and universal. As you drift into sleep, perhaps you'll think about who you've lost, who you remember, who you hope will remember you. Death comes for everyone, but memory can persist. Images can outlast lives. Love can be documented even when the beloved is gone. These Victorian photographs, strange as they are, testify to love's persistence in the face of death, to the human need to remember, to the desire to make loss somehow bearable through preservation and art. Rest now, knowing that the children in these photographs are long at peace. Their suffering, if they suffered, ended more than a century ago. The parents who grieve them are reunited in death if they believed in such reunions, or simply at peace in the earth if they didn't. The photographers who created these images have themselves been photographed, memorialized, and remembered or forgotten according to their own legacies. The photographs remain, strange visitors from the past, reminding us that death is real, that grief is universal, that love persists even when everything else fades. They teach us to honor the dead, to face mortality with whatever courage we can muster, and to preserve what we can even knowing that ultimately everything is lost. Sleep well, and may you dream peacefully. May you wake refreshed, perhaps thinking differently about death, memory, and the images we create to hold on to those we love. The history of post-mortem photography is complete, but its lessons continue, as enduring as the photographs themselves. Good night.